Welcome to the City. I'm Anthony Wilson, the Public Information Officer for the City of San Angelo. And joining us today is our Water Utilities Director, Bill Riley. Bill, thank you for being with us.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Now, you joined the city back in December. For folks who haven't met you yet, talk a little bit about your background.
Well, spent about 17 years with City of College Station, majority of that managing the water and wastewater utilities there. Back about 15 years ago, I started a consulting firm and have been working with utilities on financial planning and water resource development since that time.
And what interested you about the job here in San Angelo and led you to this place?
Well, you know, one thing as a consultant, I got to work with a lot of entities around the country, mostly in the state of Texas, that had a lot of interesting challenges. I don't think any of them had more challenges than we have here in San Angelo as far as water supply and infrastructure. And so it's kind of a good career move, I think, for me, the opportunity to come here and be part of this city and part of this organization and help to solve some of those issues seemed like a good fit for me and something I really wanted to undertake.
Well, as you mentioned, it's certainly a challenging time to be the Water Utilities Director because despite a lot of abundant rainfall, San Angelo is still in the throes of an historic drought. And I wanted to get your thoughts on what you think is the best way for us to move through this time in the short term.
You know, that's an interesting question, Anthony, because the short term is kind of might be a misnomer as far as the drought. We've been in this part of West Texas in a drought for a long time, and as you look at the lake levels, they've been in decline for some time. But I think it's important for us to consider right now as far as looking at our water supply and what would be considered what we need to do right now is to continue to encourage conservation practices and how we use the water. I think that's a really important thing for us is to the citizens in San Angelo they've been forced to conserve and they've embraced that, and I think that's very commendable. So now I think the challenge is for us to continue encouraging that and how we use the water and keep the use as low as possible while we continue to look for additional water supplies.
Well, it's a very fine line, though, between the need to conserve water and then also the need to sell water because that's how you generate the revenues that are necessary to both operate the water utilities and to make the infrastructure improvements that the system needs. How do you go about balancing that need to conserve versus the need to raise revenue?
You know, that's a real issue and one that impacts any entity that is really promoting conservation. And the two go hand in hand. Obviously, the utility makes its finances through selling water, and so when that drops off, so does the revenue stream. And if you don't adjust to that, then it can have a major impact on your ability to develop new water supplies or maintain the infrastructure. That has happened here in San Angelo. As the water use declined substantially, so did the revenue stream. And so it is a fine balance, but it's one that you have to take into consideration to continue to be viable.
When you talk about conservation, is there a particular philosophy that you think that the city needs to adopt or adapt to?
That's a real interesting question, and I think one that the city is probably wrestling with right now on what is the best method. I think landscaping is an important part of what we need to be looking at. Commercial landscaping. Same time, you want to make sure your city is still pretty. You know, that it's pleasing to the eye, if you will. And so I think there's ways to do that. We're in a desert, so maybe start developing more desert-type landscaping, especially for commercial entities. Overall, and over a period of time, you'll see the water use for irrigation specifically begin to drop.
I know in some communities that have particularly arid climates, they restrict the amount of turf that you can have in your landscape, whether you're a commercial business or a residential home. Is that something that should be considered?
Absolutely, I think so. I think that's a direction that the city should look to go. And again, it's something that you want to make sure that you have planned, and so that while you accomplish two things, you just continue to the beautification of your city, maybe a little bit different than having a lot of green, but it certainly can be just as attractive, but also conserving water like it should be done.
Should the city more actively incentivize people to conserve water? And if so, what might some of those measures be?
Well, that's also an interesting question because at some point the return on that investment is just not there. And I think that's kind of where we're at in San Angelo, is while there's still, we need to look at incentives, but we're kind of in a maintain mode, I think, as far as just the general users. But I think from the landscaping and the irrigation perspective, I think there certainly could be some incentives that could be offered for either rainwater harvesting or other methods of reducing irrigation through landscape.
Maybe explain a little bit about why addressing landscaping is so important, because people may not realize how much of the water that we use, particularly in this time of the year during the summertime, is devoted to irrigating landscapes.
Yeah, and it's substantial, not only in San Angelo, but across the country. The majority of the water that is used goes for irrigation or other than human consumption or domestic uses. And so, for example, it's generally the water demand more than doubles in the summertime, which is strictly just irrigation. And so that's a critical place or area that we can need to focus to reduce water consumption.
As we talked about a little bit earlier, part of the equation for conservation and for good fiscal management is the water rates. What is your water rate study that you're currently engaged in? What is it telling us about that we should do with our water rates?
Well, the water utility is not in the best financial position. I think everybody knows that. And so we have to look at how to maintain the viability of the financial position of the utility. That's critical because of not only the additional water supplies that we need, which are not cheap. In fact, all the cheap water in this state's gone. And so to develop any additional water supplies, it's going to cost a lot of money. Add on top of that the infrastructure replacement or rehabilitation needs that we have. It means that we need the finances to do that, and we don't have them. So the rate study is showing us that we're going to have some substantial increases in the water rates.
And how do you go about explaining to citizens in a way that they not only understand but maybe accept that water rates are going to have to go up?
Well, I think everybody understands the need for water, and that's kind of where we're at. We have to develop additional water supplies, and the conversations that I've had within the community is I think people really do understand that, and they're willing, or I should say more than willing, they're embracing that idea. They're willing to pay for it to have water, and I think that's a big step here. But I also think it's just important, again, for education, for everybody to understand where we're at, what we need to do, that we're also being good stewards of what we do have, and that we're have an efficient operation.
I know from a prior water advisory board meeting, your consultant touched on the fact that your water rates also do help with your conservation efforts, and it does incentivize people financially to conserve water. Talk a little bit about the role that conservation will play in your water rates.
Well, and that's a good point. The water rates will have what's called an inverted rate, which just means the more water you use, the higher the rate per 1,000 gallons. That's a method that has been embraced by the state and by utilities across the country as a means of promoting water conservation. Now, the question is, a lot of times, is how high do the rates have to be before it really makes a difference? But I think it's in any case, it helps people to understand that there's a reason why it's that way. And just because it might not hurt me, financially a lot, but it does help me be aware that there's a reason why I'm paying more for the more water I use, and therefore I ought to maybe be a little bit more conservation minded. You
mentioned a little bit earlier about the need to invest in San Angelo's water infrastructure and to make improvements in that. What is the state of our water infrastructure at the time?
Well, we have some real needs. The water infrastructure, the water lines, transmission lines, the distribution lines, all of them are old. They, for the most part, have exceeded their expected life. So we really need to be making some improvements. The real downside of that is water loss. I mean, the more breaks that we have, as the infrastructure ages, you have more breaks, then you have more loss, and that kind of compounds your the water supply issue. So they really run hand in hand, and on top of that, it's a decrease in the quality of service that we're providing to the customers when we continually have outages or breaks and streets dug up and those kind of things. So we have some real needs in infrastructure that have to be addressed, and that's just as important as any new water supply.
You mentioned something to me the other day that I had never considered, and that is you really can't maintain a water line. You install it, You know, occasionally you have to repair it when it has leaks, but you can't really extend the life of it through maintenance. Once it's reached its lifespan, it just simply has to be replaced.
And that's correct. I mean, you maintain it through, I mean, you fix the leaks, but there's not really anything you can do to extend its life in general. And so as it gets older, it becomes time that you begin to replace that. What you hope to do is do that over a systematic process through the years, so that you don't have a lot of it at any one time and you spread those costs over a period of time. We're kind of in a point right now where we have a lot of it to do, and so we've got to figure out how to do that.
When you talk about water loss, how much do you think that or do you know that how much water that we lose via our lines because they're old, aging, rusting infrastructure? How much do we lose, and how much could we potentially reduce that amount by investing more aggressively in our infrastructure?
Currently, you have overall a loss between 16 and 18%. All of that is not due to breaks in the water lines, and it's not lost through leaks. That's flushing that we have to do. It's done. The fire department has to use a certain amount of water. There's several things that contribute to that, but probably about 10% of that is lost through leaks in the infrastructure. And that's a lot, and we certainly are working to try to reduce that, and we need to. I would think that if we could get that down to 5 to 6%, that would be pretty good. You're always going to have some losses. Water systems have breaks, and you have losses to that, but 5 or 6% loss through leaks would be good, and we really have a goal to get there.
We're talking with Bill Riley. He is the Water Utilities Director for the City of San Angelo, and we'll be back in just one moment.
Since January 2014, approximately 10,000 animals, mostly unwanted dogs and cats, have entered the San Angelo Animal Shelter. Of those, approximately 7,000 have been euthanized. In an effort to help stem San Angelo's pet overpopulation problem and the shelter's kill rate, the City Council on August 4th expressed its interest in a mandatory spay and neuter ordinance for pets. James Flores, the city's Assistant Director of Neighborhood and Family Services, explained to the council that many other cities have successfully adopted spay and neuter ordinances as one means of reducing indiscriminate breeding. Flores said if passed, the ordinance would involve secondary enforcement. That is, an unaltered pet would be subject to sterilization if, for example, it were caught running loose by an animal control officer. Owners could also face fines. The ordinance would require that all dogs and cats older than 4 months would be spayed or neutered and microchipped. There would be exceptions for licensed breeders, medical reasons documented by a veterinarian, competition animals, and law enforcement dogs. The city would also seek to provide low-cost operations for low-income families. Flores noted some of the benefits of sterilizing pets are that it reduces the incidence of certain types of cancer. Altered pets focus more on their human families, and the procedure lessens a pet's desire to fight, spay, or roam.
A mandatory spay-neuter ordinance is proven. There's cities that are old in this capacity that have had that law locally implemented, and they've seen the numbers decline in intake. They've seen the adoptability rates go up, lesser parvoed animals, lesser diseased animals. Again, it's all about responsibility at the end of the day.
Some city council members bristled at a mandatory regulation. However, most said the ordinance is needed to help control a growing community problem that costs taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars annually.
I think there is a growing movement of people who care about this. Again, no one is trying to take rights away from anybody in the idea of responsible pet ownership. But how are we moving from a shelter to a kill facility? Is that really what we want? Is that what we want to support?
The discussion drew an unusually large number of citizens to the city council meeting. Most voiced staunch support for a spay and neuter ordinance. Jillian Haddad owns 5 shelter dogs, all of whom are fixed. She said the local culture regarding pet ownership is vastly different than in her home state of Wisconsin.
In May and June, I think San Angelo killed 576 animals, and it's getting out of control, and the only way to stop it, in my opinion, is getting ahead of it with a spay-neuter program so it can slow down the future problems.
The City Council is expected to consider a first draft of a spay-neuter ordinance in September. For SATV, I'm Brian Groves.
Welcome back. We are continuing our conversation with Bill Riley. He is our Water Utilities Director for the City of San Angelo. Bill, before the break, we were talking about investment in our infrastructure. Talk about the water main replacement program, how much water line we are replacing each year, and what the total need is.
Well, the total need is kind of a moving target. We are trying to get our hands around exactly how much we need to replace now. Currently, we are spending about a little less than $3 million a year on infrastructure replacement, water infrastructure replacement. That's about 4 or 5 miles of line max. We probably need to double that to be able to make some real improvements.
And is that something that that you're going to be aiming for when you look at water rates and cost and revenue and all those things during this budget session?
Absolutely. We are looking at it, the whole picture is obviously, as we talked about a minute ago, we're going to have to raise rates. But there's some other things. We have some debt service that is going away, and so we're looking at how we can increase the amount that we're spending on infrastructure replacement with those things, as well as what we talked about as developing additional water supplies.
One last infrastructure question. What's the state of our water treatment plant?
The water treatment plant is old, but it's in good shape. We've got a project now that we are fixing to start that replaces some of the valves in the system that are leaking, and so we're actually losing water through there. So we'll replace those valves that will actually help us quite a bit in maintaining as much water as we can through the process. But overall, I think the plant's in decent condition.
Of course, our newest infrastructure would be that related to the Hickory Aquifer. How is that performing?
It's performing great. It's online. We're using the Hickory plant now. The well field construction is not complete, but enough of it is that we're able to bring substantial amount of water into the city if we needed to. But the plant is operating just in a minimum state right now, just because it has to operate. So we're probably bringing about 1 million to 1.5 million gallons a day through that plant, and the plant is working just great.
And talk about why you're using only 1 million gallons per day and why you're not using more of that. What your approach to the use of Hickory water is.
The Hickory water was developed as a backup supply. It wasn't developed to be our primary supply. The primary supply is Lake Ivy right now, and we have all of our needs we're able to take from Ivy. So, and part of the issue with the Hickory water is if we don't use our annual allocated amount, we are able to bank that water for use in the future, and that's how the permits that we have with the district read. So right now, if we don't need it, we're trying to bank as much as possible for any emergency or times that we would need it in the future.
So in other words, if we were in the most dire straits, that could potentially be our primary water source.
It could be. We hope that we never get to that point, but it certainly could be. And if it has to be, we want to make sure that we have as much of it there as possible.
And of course, you have a lot of different surface water assets in your inventory. How do you determine which of those you're going to pull water from and use on any given day?
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. We have Lake Ivy, obviously Twin Buttes, Nasworthy, and O.C. Fisher, all which fortunately picked up some water. They're still very low, but they do have some additional water supply in them, which is a good thing. But Ivy is our primary supply. We have a contract with the Colorado River Municipal Water District. We pay for that water whether we take it or not. And so because of that, we're going to take water out of Ivy in the event that we can. And since the water's there, that's going to be our first choice. It also allows us to leave water in the local lakes as much as possible.
And so when you look at that surface water inventory as a whole, how would you assess its current state?
Not very good, actually. Ivy is still at about 16% full, so that means probably not much more than a year with no inflow, which hopefully that won't be the case, but that is about the extent of what it would last. Twin Buttes is about 10%. O.C. Fisher is not much more than that. So all in all, it's really not the best of situations, especially when you look around the state. And most of the other lakes in the state are full or close to full, and we still just aren't part of that.
Is it concerning? Do you think there's a misperception of that because of all the abundant rainfall that we've gotten this year, that we're sort of out of the woods when it comes to our surface water supply, and people think that there's actually more water in the lakes than there actually is?
I absolutely think so. I've heard that a lot from folks that just think that, and it's a reasonable thing to think. When you see the news and they talk about the droughts over, and you see the floods and the rain that we've had here, it would be very normal to think that we're in good shape. But unfortunately, our lakes did not pick up very much water at all, even though we've had a good amount of rain.
And people, I don't think, really fully appreciate how much water is lost during this time of year, particularly to evaporation. Talk about that.
It's enormous. You just don't realize how much water that you actually lose through evaporation. And unfortunately, we're coming into a time period right now where we're looking at multiple more days of 100+ degree temperature, the humidity dropping. It's just going to suck the water out of the lakes. I mean, they drop inches a day.
You're about to embark on a pilot testing program to look at the potential reuse, potable reuse of our wastewater. Talk about what that will entail.
Well, the pilot is a necessary process. The state requires you to actually test, basically, if the system that you're proposing will treat the water that you have to the levels that you have to make it potable. So we have to go through that process. So we'll bring in basically it's just set up a small treatment facility and see if we can in fact make drinking water out of the wastewater.
One of the few criticisms I've heard about that is people say they're doing it in Wichita Falls already, they're doing it in Big Spring. Why is there a need for a pilot testing program? Talk about that.
Yeah, and that's a good question, except that there's two answers to that, I think. One is you're required to do it. The state requires us to prove to them that we can do what we're saying to do. The other thing is we want to do that. We want to know. We want to make sure that it's an expensive project. And so we want to make sure that we can actually accomplish the end goal before we spend the money that it would take to implement something like that.
And I think you previously mentioned to me that if we're going to look to the Texas Water Development Board to help us finance such a project, which is estimated to cost about $130 million at this point, much as we did with the Hickory Aquifer, the Water Board requires that sort of testing be done.
They do. That's important. The primary requirement of that through the TCEQ, but it's the state of Texas, and they want to know that if they're going to loan you that kind of money, that you, again, can accomplish what you're setting out to do.
You're also going to be spending the coming year measuring the amount of water that's flowing through the Red Arroyo to determine whether or not it's worth pursuing capturing some of that water. Talk a little bit about what that project will entail.
Well, and that's it. We're currently monitoring the groundwater under where the basin would be to see if it's even feasible to construct a basin of that size. At the same time, we want to know is how much water is coming down the Red Arroyo. It's easy to see it when you've got a lot of rain, but it doesn't always rain. And so there's a lot of small rains too that we want to see what could we actually pick up. I don't think that we need another hole in the ground or dry hole in the ground. We need to make sure that if we pursue that, that there's a return on that investment and we can actually pick up enough water to make it worthwhile.
And have you determined what that dividing line is, where it's financially feasible to pursue the project knowing that it's going to yield you a certain amount of water?
I don't think so, Anthony. I think that still needs to be studied a little bit to see what really is feasible. And I think the information that we're going to get from the groundwater monitoring and the flowing in the river, the stream, will help us to understand that and be able to calculate or determine is it really worth pursuing, or should we put that money in looking somewhere else?
You've also been involved since you've joined the city in the discussions with the West Texas Water Partnership, which is a collaboration between the cities of San Angelo, Midland, and Abilene to look at long-term water sources, maybe 100-year water sources. What struck you most about that effort and those discussions thus far?
Well, it's a great process, and it always is when you can have entities like that come together and try to solve big problems together. It just makes it a lot more feasible to do, and I think that's the case here. Unfortunately, or the reality is that the short-term supplies, each entity is met on their own or having to meet on their own. So it pushes it out, like I said, out into the long-term supply. That's a real problem in the state right now, is where is there available water to bring into West Texas or anywhere. And so I think with the three entities together, there's a real opportunity to do that. And it gives us not only the financial ability to do that, it also provides some political clout. And I think from the legislative perspective is when they see three major West Texas entities pulling together to solve those problems, they pay attention to that. And I think it helps us to get a little bit more momentum, if you will, to find those supplies and to develop those supplies.
So it sounds like right now then your priority is really the reuse of wastewater. How much water are we talking about that could potentially yield for San Angelo?
That is, I think, our number one focus right now. From my opinion, that's probably the only guaranteed water. Well, it is the only guaranteed water that we have that we can produce. And so I think it's a real viable project. It will help San Angelo to get to have a sustainable supply if we do lose, the surface water supplies. The project is the treatment. Right now, our treatment plant produces about 9 million gallons a day. We would anticipate that we would get about 7 million gallons a day of that. We would lose the other 2 million gallons through the RO process because it would just be concentrated too much to be able to use. So that would return 7 MGD back to the city every day. And so if we were down to only the Hickory supply, with the reuse, we could meet the daily demand in San Angelo.
We've been talking with Bill Riley. He is the Water Utilities Director for the City of San Angelo, and we hope you'll join us for the next episode of The City.